We're diving into an invention so incredibly basic that you probably rarely even think about it. But this little piece of metal literally industrialized the horse, and in doing so, it changed the entire world. Yep, we're talking about the horseshoe.
But to really understand why this piece of metal was such a game changer, we first have to ask a remarkably simple question. Why do horses even need shoes in the first place? I mean, wild horses don't have farriers running around after them, right? Well, out in the wild, horses travel across these dry, arid steppe climates. They usually move at pretty slow speeds as they graze and forage. And all that natural, continuous movement on dry ground? It wears their hooves down to a really smooth, hard state that perfectly balances with how fast the hoof naturally grows. But domesticated horses, they face a massive biological problem under the weight of human progress.
And that biological problem brings us to a super famous proverb, published in an English Farrier treatise way back in 1751. It simply says, "No foot, no horse." It perfectly hits the nail on the head. No matter how incredibly strong or fast or well-trained a horse is, if their feet are compromised, the animals simply cannot function, period. Proper hoof care is the absolute foundation of all equine health.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here is our roadmap for today's explainer. First, we'll look at nature's biological problem. Then, changing human history, followed by how shoeing actually works. After that, we'll tackle the great barefoot debate, and finally, wrap up with the high-tech future.
All right, Section 1, Nature's Biological Problem. Let's look at the biological baseline before humans ever got involved.
To truly appreciate the technology of a horseshoe, we have to look really closely at the hoof itself. Think of it not as a static, rigid block of wood, but as a dynamic, moving capsule. When a horse's foot hits the dirt, it actually spreads out, about 2 to 4 millimeters, to absorb those massive ground reaction forces. But here's the really wild part. It acts as a hemodynamic pump. You see, a horse's lower leg doesn't really have the muscles needed to push blood all the way back up to its heart. So the physical compression of the fleshy pads inside the hoof, that actually does the pumping for them. It's an amazing piece of natural engineering. But here's the rub. When humans domesticated horses, we completely flipped their environment and their workload upside down. Suddenly, we're asking them to carry insanely heavy loads, like knights wearing full iron armor. We force them to travel on extremely hard, abrasive surfaces, like paved Roman roads. And we move them out of those dry steppes and into really wet, damp climates. Under all these human-imposed conditions, the hoof wall just wore down way faster than it could naturally grow back. It made the horses lame. So humanity desperately needed a technological hack to keep these vital animals sound and working.
Which brings us to Section 2, Changing Human History. Let's see how humanity evolved to solve this biological limitation.
Let's take a quick walk through time here. Around 400 BC, we see our very first attempts at hoof protection. Over in ancient Asia, they were using these temporary booties made out of rawhide and plants. Meanwhile, the Romans were using solid-bottomed iron hippo sandals that literally strapped on with leather. Fast forward a bit to around 1000 AD in Europe, and we see the widespread adoption of the nailed-on, scalloped bronze shoes. And then, boom, 1835. The Industrial Revolution takes over, and a guy named Henry Burden patents a machine to mass-produce metal horseshoes at incredible speeds.
So, the crucial point here is that this jump to the nailed iron shoe fueled an absolute agricultural revolution. Before the horseshoe, horses just couldn't effectively work the damp, heavy clay soils of northern Europe. Their hooves would get soft and break down. But that iron shoe? It provided the sheer durability and the traction they needed to pull massive, heavy iron plows right through that dense terrain. This vastly increased crop yields, which in turn fueled a massive population boom and helped build the towns and cities of medieval Europe.
And the industrial impact of this was just staggering. I mean, look at this number, 50 million. By the American Civil War, Henry Burden's machine was churning out 50 million horseshoes a year. That's enough to keep entire armies on the move. In fact, it gave the well-shod Union Army a decisive logistical advantage over the South. The South just didn't have the manufacturing facilities, and they actually often had to resort to raiding Union supplies just to keep their own horses moving.
All right, let's jump to Section 3, How Showing Actually Works. Let's look at the real-world mechanics of the modern farrier's craft.
We've seen the history, but how does this actually work today? Well, it's a step-by-step process. First, the farrier removes the old shoe and cleans out the bottom of the foot. Second, they trim the overgrown hoof wall with nippers and level it completely flat with a rasp. Third, in a lot of cases, they'll heat the steel shoe in a literal forge and press it right against the hoof. This is called a hot fit, and it ensures a completely perfect custom match. Finally, the shoe is nailed in place, and the ends of the nails are bent over or clinched to lock it on. Now, you might be thinking, no way. Doesn't driving nails into a foot hurt the animal? Nope, not at all. The outer hoof wall is made of keratin. That's the exact same stuff your fingernails are made of. So, driving a nail into that insensitive horn is exactly like clipping your fingernails.
And farriers today have a whole array of modern materials at their disposal, depending on what the horse needs. Steel is still your traditional standard. It gives you maximum durability for heavy working and riding horses. Aluminum, on the other hand, is significantly lighter. It's the absolute go-to for racehorses, where every single ounce matters for speed. And then we have synthetic materials, like polyurethane. These are often glued directly onto the foot and provide incredible, flexible shock absorption.
Section 4. The Great Barefoot Debate. Should domestic horses be shod or left unshod?
Now, within the modern equine community, there is actually an ongoing, pretty passionate discussion regarding this. The barefoot advocates point out that leaving the hoof totally natural allows for the absolute best expansion of the hoof wall. It gives you optimal shock absorption and unhindered blood flow. They even point to studies showing that metal shoes can sometimes restrict the natural movement of the heel. On the other side of the aisle, shod advocates point out that shoes provide essential, undeniable protection for horses that are working on pavement or really abrasive dirt. They provide the necessary traction for high-speed sports, and they offer absolutely critical therapeutic support for horses that are recovering from injuries.
Ultimately, as this quote really perfectly summarizes, biomechanical efficiency is the guiding principle. What we take away from the sources here is that there really is no universal right answer. The choice to shoe a horse or to let it go barefoot depends entirely on that individual horse. You have to look at their age, their physical conformation, their living environment, and the exact workload they're being asked to perform.
Let's wrap things up with Section 5, the high-tech future. How cutting-edge science is evolving this ancient tool. And this brilliantly illustrates where we are heading. We are officially transitioning from the forge and the anvil straight into the digital age. The next generation of equine podiatry is honestly straight out of science fiction. We're talking about the introduction of custom 3D-printed titanium shoes, the development of integrated smart sensors, and the cutting-edge use of antimicrobial copper alloys. Take the 3D-printed titanium revolution, for example. Back in 2013, researchers at Australia's CSIRO achieved a massive breakthrough. They figured out how to use handheld 3D scanners to perfectly map a racehorse's hooves and then print custom, perfectly fitted titanium shoes in just a matter of hours. Because titanium is so incredibly strong yet super light, these shoes cut the weight by up to half compared to traditional aluminum. This allows racehorses to potentially reach entirely new speeds, all while getting highly customized orthopedic support.
But it's not just about speed, it's about health. We're seeing new copper alloy shoes being used because copper naturally fights off bacterial and fungal infections, stuff like thrush, that really plague horses living in wet environments. On top of that, researchers are actively developing smart shoes packed with tiny integrated sensors. Think of them as bio-wearables for horses. They monitor real-time weight distribution, hoof pressure, and do complex gait analysis. They can literally detect the microscopic early signs of lameness before it ever becomes a painful, career-ending injury.
So all of this leaves us with a pretty fascinating question to ponder. Will the 3,000-year-old traditional metal horseshoe soon be replaced entirely by digital biowearables and 3D-printed polymers? We have traveled all the way from ancient Asian rawhide booties to the heavy iron plows of medieval Europe, right up to modern titanium racing flats. The horseshoe industrialized the horse, and in turn, the horse basically built our modern world. It really makes you wonder what the next leap in equine biomechanics will allow us to achieve together.
Don't forget to like and subscribe for more How Meets History.